G'day YouTube, Warbles on a lot here. It's not first Moondog, it'll just have to be a Warblerant.
Woman of the Year. So
Yeah,
we've come a
things
long
have
way
moved
in a
on.
short time.
Thanks to our outsiders this morning, horse experts all, Gail Morgan, Sarah Martin and Tony Wilson. We'll have more chat of that nature next week. That's it for Iron Man Sunday Extra. If you've missed anything, the podcast is there on the website or iTunes. The last hour is on SoundCloud. Senior producer for the program is Serpil Chanel, Michelle Weeks, Mike Woods, Mira Adler-Gillies help out as well. Matthew Crawford does the Birds technical production this morning by John Jacobs. Between the Lines is next with Tom Switzer. Today, critics give Donald Trump the kiss of death, but he thrives on it. News time now, 10 o'clock.
Yeah, well, Donald Trump, I gotta say that I think of him as duck fucking Donald's comb over. If that language offends anybody, well, tough shit, it's my channel. I'm one of the people who believes that the occasional swear word or a bit of profanity actually adds colour to the language. It adds form and shape and texture to what can otherwise be pretty dry and boring. But yeah, Donald Trump's comb over, I think that comb over is going to be elected to the Oval Office. I say that because I can remember being firmly convinced that the Americans were not stupid enough to elect Ronald Reagan Zapp. And Ronald Reagan Zapp became the pretty dunce of America twice. And, I've got to say, America really went down the gurgling hole during Reagan's presidency. And there's no reason to expect that they've learnt anything by it, because one of the things Reagan did was he repealed the congressional obligation on public broadcasters to tell the truth. He thought that they could make a lot more money if they just broadcast opinions. So you got, Alex Jones and what's his name, Rush Limbaugh, venting their right-wing neo-fascist crony capitalist spleens across the airwaves of the excited states. And they're kind of locked into it. I think a lot of Americans get a bit of a laugh out of Donald Trump. He probably articulates what a percentage of the population really thinks. And here's the kicker. Americans have a voluntary voting system. You don't have to vote. And in fact, less than 50% of their population turns up. Recently, their elections have been, 40-something percent. So if 40% of the people who can vote turn out to vote, you only need 21% of the entire population to win the vote, to win the count. So out of all the people in America who care enough to vote and can be bothered to get there on the day, do I think that 21+% of them are going to vote for Donald Trump? Yeah, I think they probably will. I think at this point, even if he doesn't get the Republican nomination, he can probably do a backflip on his vow not to stand as an independent. He'd still have more money than the Republican Party put together. And then he could go in there and, rather than splitting their vote, I think he would actually win the contest. What duck fucking Donald is going to do when he gets in is anybody's guess. I mean, he's said that he's going to build a wall across the Mexican border and make the Mexicans pay for it. He says that he's a really good businessman and he can, he can out-abacus the Chinese. I don't know how true that's going to prove. My understanding is that in China there is no history of having old age pensions, so everybody saves at least 10% of their after-tax income, and they put that aside for their retirement, which means that Chinese savings banks have been awash with cash ever since the Communist Party said, let's be, pseudo-communists and closet capitalists and see how rich we can get. The Chinese banks, they've got these prudential requirements that say you have to go and sink some of your money into a government security so that if there's a run on the banks, the assets are protected. And really the only place to buy such government securities has been the American Treasury. So the Chinese savings banks have been propping up the American Treasury, which has allowed the American government to continue to operate at a deficit. which has allowed the American economy to continue to look as if it's growing, which means that there has been enough liquid cash in the excited states to purchase cheap Chinese shiny everythings. That's where the Chinese market demand has been coming from in America, is Chinese savings banks lending their money to America. And you've got this sort of Ponzi-esque feedback loop going on between America and China, where the Americans can't afford to stop borrowing from China and they can't afford to pay the Chinese back, but the Chinese can't afford to stop lending money to America, because if they stop lending the money to the Americans, then they won't have any market demand for their factories. It's cute, isn't it? Ponzi. That was the name of the fellow who cooked up a scheme where you sell an investment and the people who buy their share of the investment are effectively paying previous people who bought a share in the investment, because the enterprise doesn't produce any actual profits apart from selling shares in itself. That's what a Ponzi scheme is. So yeah, we've got this Donald Trump fella coming in to power, or looking as if he may come into power, at a time when the American economy is pretty sick. And the Chinese economy became pretty sick recently. And the Chinese are attempting to act on the terms of the 1945 peace treaty, which stopped the war in the Pacific, treaty which was signed by America and Great Britain and Australia and New Zealand, and I think the Philippines might have signed it, the Dutch signed it, the Japanese were surrendering, so they signed it. And the treaty says that there's some rocks which used to be awash at low tide called the Spratly Islands, and those rocks belong to China. That's what America said in 1945 when, drugless MacArthur signed the treaty. Chinese land out there in the ocean. These days, America is backing the new Japanese Prime Minister, who has removed the no belligerency clause from the Japanese constitution. So now the Japanese are allowed to have military forces rather than defence forces. They've got the ambition to go and take part in some of the wars that America is losing all over the world. And the Americans seem to think that the answer to ISIL is going to be a battalion of origami sword-wielding ninjutsu. Right? They're going to have origami swords, and they're going to run bonsai charges, not banzai, but bonsai charges, where they will run across the desert holding miniature oak trees in dirty little pots, and they will use their origami swords to slice ISIL up into little 3-inch cubes. That's apparently the plan, and therefore, because America wants Japan to help a kamikaze attack on ISIL, help with a kamikaze attack on ISIL, because every time anybody seems to attack ISIL, ISIL hands their ass to them, including Russia, who will get there shortly too. Thus, and because America is backing Japanese claims that China doesn't own the Spratly Islands, and the Chinese have gone out there and they've dredged up sand and packed the sand onto the islands, and then they've put a runway on it, so they've actually got an airbase on the island. And the Americans are deciding that, well, we're going to respect the 12-mile limit from the shoreline of mainland China. We're not going to respect the 12-mile limit from the shoreline of the Spratly Islands. They consider it polite to steam a carrier battle group 500 metres from the surf line, and they say they are going to demonstrate their right to do that. This is at a time when NASA's attempting to buy seats on the Chinese launch to orbit, because Soyuz is getting pretty old, and Russia's not quite fighting on the American side in Syria. The Russians and the Americans say that they are both fighting ISIL, but the Russians keep bombing the Kurds, and the Kurds are the American allies. And as I said, we'll have to get onto the Russians in the sense that they've had an aeroplane fall onto the ground. An Airbus run by Metrojet out of Russia was taking off from Egypt to go back to St. Petersburg, and it went from ground level, 31,000 feet in 26 minutes, and it suddenly stuck its nose down, dived, lost 6,000 feet or 2,000 metres, pulled its nose up, pushed its nose down, pulled its nose up. Then there was a noise heard in the last second of cockpit voice recorder, a very loud noise, And then little bits of the Airbus were found over a 20 kilometre by 8 kilometre elliptical debris splatter path, indicating that the aeroplane broke up at altitude and the bits fell to the ground. But what caused it to break up? Well, immediately that it happened, ISIL said, ha ha, we got one. Whereupon the Russians said, oh, no, 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 you couldn't have done that. You know, like we're Russians, you didn't do that. And the Egyptians said, oh, no, 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 you can't frighten the tourists by saying that. No, 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 it was something else. And days went by, and eventually they come to the conclusion that there isn't actually anything intrinsic with an Airbus that'll make it do that. Last I heard anybody who sounded like they more or less knew what they were talking about on the subject, it was suggested that some kind of a device may have been set among the flight computers, and it was suggested the Airbus has 3 different computers, and as one system has failed and it's gone into the dive, another system's tried to pull the nose up and that's failed, and then that's happened again to the 3rd backup system. That doesn't make the aeroplane fall to pieces. I've also got a bit of curiosity about the batteries, the backup batteries that all of these computers run on. I'm wondering whether the Airbus that the Russians had might have had some old lithium-ion batteries as backups, and maybe the lithium-ion batteries that were feeding the computers caught fire. If the batteries caught fire, you'd get random voltage surges which might have knocked the flight computers out a couple of times. Pretty hard to fly a fly-by-wire airliner with no batteries for the flight, or with no computer because there's electrical surges because the batteries are on fire. But even so, you wouldn't really expect a battery fire to break the aeroplane up into lots of tiny, weeny, little itsy-bitsy pieces scattered all over the desert. So it's a mystery. Something's happened. ISIL says they did it. All the authorities are saying, yeah, well, it was probably an extrinsic factor, something other than the aeroplane caused it to go wrong. And who is it who's got the shits with Russia about aeroplanes crashing after blowing up in the sky? I would have thought a place called Malaysia might have the shits with Russia, because the Russians did supply a Buk surface-to-air missile to a bunch of Russian-sponsored insurgents and rebels in a place called Ukraine. And the Ukrainian rebels did actually shoot down a Malaysian airliner, killing everybody on board. And Malaysia's one of those countries where everybody's pretty much Muslim. And Malaysia's one of those countries that supplies cheap labour to Dubai to try and build that shining edifice on the edge of the ocean so that the tourist in 20 years' time can, I don't know, turn up and watch global warming flood Dubai, in the same way that the Americans and the Chinese are going to have to watch global warming submerge the Spratly Islands that they're busy arguing about and thinking about having a fight over. One wonders why anybody would invest anything on a beachfront. Global warming, sea level rise, madness. Just don't go there. Don't buy anything that's within 120 metres of sea level today, because Greenland, East Antarctica, West Antarctica, if they all go, we're looking at 120 to 160 metres of sea level rise. We're already on track for between 5 and 7 metres by the end of this century. The Spratly Islands is going to be a scuba park. Dubai is going to be a scuba park. But what are the odds that some of the people who've gone from Malaysia to Dubai to build the city have then escaped from the concentration camps that the slave labourers are being kept by the bloody Arabs, and they've gone off and joined ISIL? Is that a possibility, or am I just plucking shit out of me imagination? Either one are valid answers. I think it's possible. And I think it's yet another nail in the coffin of international air tourism. And I think that's a really good thing, because international air tourism produces at least as much carbon dioxide emissions as the entire internet put together. But everybody has a crack at the internet. Only people who can afford to go on a clap-catching expedition to Bali, or skiing in Aspen, Colorado, or looking at the beef eaters with their bearskin hats in England, only those sort of people who flame fart around the world on kerosene-powered jumbo jets, they're the ones who are putting out 10% of the world's global greenhouse emissions with tourism. Warbles on a lot to YouTube. Ciao.